Great. So welcome to our social media and media session as part of the Refugee Week Slow Conference. I'm Cheyenne and I'm Social Media Officer at Counterpoints Arts, and I'm going to introduce Niall and Katherine.
Yeah, good morning. So I'm Niall. I work for a charity called IMIX and I'm the Regional Communications Manager. And my colleague Katherine is our Digital Media and Social Media Manager and expert. We're a small charity. We work across the migration sector, everything from EU citizens to Windrush, and of course, people seeking sanctuary and people who are undocumented, providing media and communication support to the sector. So when they're working with press, doing trainings like we are today, and general support like that throughout the year. And you'll hear more from us in just a couple of minutes' time.
Hi, I'm Katherine and I also work at IMIX. I'm the Digital Communications Manager, so I work with charities and organisations across the refugee and migration space to improve their communications on social media. It's great to be with you today.
Amazing. So Emily, actually Katherine, if we could go on to the next slide. Great. So hello and welcome again to the Refugee Week Slow Conference, which is a series of free online workshops and on arts and culture for change running from today to the 11th of March. So the conference is part of the build up to Refugee Week, which is a UK-wide festival celebrating the contributions, creativity and resilience of refugees, which is from the 14th to the 20th of June this year. And the theme of this year's Refugee Week is We Cannot Walk Alone, which is an invitation to extend your hand to someone new. So someone who is outside of your current circle, who has had an experience that you haven't, or who is fighting for a cause that you aren't yet involved in. If we go on to the next slide. So I'm Cheyenne and I'm the Social Media Officer at Counterpoints Arts, who are the coordinators of Refugee Week UK. We've got a few housekeeping rules for this session. Because we're quite a large group, we're going to ask you to keep yourselves on mute and to use the chat box to share your questions and comments. I can see lots of you introducing yourselves, which is great. Do turn your camera on if you're happy to, so we can all be in the space together. But if you can't or would rather not, that's totally fine with us. We really want the Refugee Week Slow Conference to be a safe and welcoming space for everyone. So we all come here from different backgrounds and different experiences and ask you to join us in being sensitive and generous to each other in our conversations. If you need to step out at any time, that's of course fine. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can send a message to Tom or Emily from Counterpoints Arts directly using the chat box, and Tom and Emily will have just given you a little wave. And as Emily mentioned at the start, I know there's a few people who've just joined us. We are filming the presentations for the Refugee Week website and social media, but only the speakers will be visible, so you don't have to worry about that. And that's all the housekeeping from me.
I'm just going to give a quick intro to this session. So this session is going to be very much focused on how you can promote your Refugee Week events through the press and on your social media accounts. Niall is going to talk a little bit about how to work with the local press to promote your event. And Cheyenne and I will talk about how to spread the word on your social media accounts. Now, we realise that both these topics are really, really big topics. And there's so many different things that we could say about working with the press and media and about working on social media. We are just going to try and stay focused on event promotion. But to let you know that Niall and I are always available if you want to have a chat about any other aspects, different aspects of your social media accounts or working with the press. And we'll bring up our email at the end so you can contact us if you want to have a more detailed conversation about an aspect of that. There will also be a social media resource sheet at the end where we just show a few things that we find helpful when we're working on our social media accounts. So we hope you find it a really helpful and useful session, and there'll be time for questions after both the section about press and media and the section about social media. So hopefully you'll be able to answer some of your questions today as well. So I'm going to hand over to Niall, who's going to talk about working with the press to promote your Refugee Week event.
Great, thank you, Catherine, and good morning, everyone. Just for those of you just joining, I'm the Regional Communications Manager for IMIX. So a big bulk of my work is working with local charities, individuals with lived experience, and also grassroots volunteer organisations, particularly across the West Midlands, helping them get in touch with their local press, be that radio, TV, newspapers, and to do that in a safe, successful and positive manner. As Katherine touched on, there's a lot we could speak about. So I've got about 5-10 minutes worth of slides, just some very basic, broad information that should be useful for you. And then there's plenty of time for questions at the end. Please do use the chat box. And that's hopefully where I can give some stronger advice. And I would say with all of this, of course, there's regional, local context and nuances to it. So for those of you in terms of thinking perhaps about engaging with the local media, perhaps a bit unsure about it, or not seeing it as an avenue or a platform open to you, I would really strongly say it is something you should all absolutely consider and can be a great resource to help amplify your event and get more people interested. Those are some of the benefits, just quite simply, that you can see from doing any sort of local media. I won't read them all out, but I guess the key one for yourself sitting there would be securing more attendees or more interest in your Refugee Week event or activity. The other key thing that you'll have seen, I know, shifting public attitudes about people seeking sanctuary, challenging stereotypes and some of the dehumanising narratives we do see out there, both on social media and in the press. That is a key ethos of Refugee Week, of course, and being welcoming, celebrating contribution, creativity, and so on. And that's a great thing that your press work, as we're showing a few slides time, can do too. And also with the growth and advent of sort of fake news on lots of different platforms, local media is actually one of the most trusted news platforms out there at the moment. We've particularly seen during the pandemic, lots and lots of people going to their local newspaper, listening to their local station to get updates on that. And with that, also having more trust in the other sorts of stories they read too. If we could move on to the next couple of slides now, because myself and Katherine, we work working for IMIX. We're the official Refugee Week partner, media-wise, so we provide lots of support both from the media side and also the social media. And these are just some of the sorts of coverage we've managed to place during the last couple of years. Some of it national, some of it local, so you can see over on the left-hand side something I worked on a couple of years ago on ITV. And also some quite niche or media you wouldn't expect. So down in the bottom right corner, that was working with CBeebies Radio a couple of years back. And smack bang in the centre, that is National Geographic Kids magazine. So actually, another thing to think about actually is when you're thinking about engaging the local press, it's not just your local ITV television station or your BBC radio station. There's lots of other outlets out there that you could approach and would be interested in hearing from you. And with that, perhaps reaching a new audience that your Facebook, your Twitter account, or traditional local newspaper might not ordinarily reach. If we could move on now, just a couple of slides to, there's a graph. And the reason I'm going to share this with you is just basically to show the correlation between the sorts of media we see and then how public attitudes sit on immigration quite broadly. Now, the reason I bring this up is for a couple of reasons, but first of all, I'll just talk a little bit about the graph. This shows, and it's all from reputable Ipsos Mori data, polling they've been conducting over the past 20 years, and showing where public attitudes sit with regards to concern about immigration, and that on a kind of broad sense. Now, you'll see around the time where there's the vote for Brexit, concern was kind of at an all-time high. And you'll also see since then, it's been on a gradual decline with the odd spike or the odd decrease along the way. And if you take your minds back for those who are in the UK or across the media at that point, around the time of Brexit, we saw a lot of dehumanising negative coverage and also consistent coverage around immigration on a daily basis. After Brexit, well, those stories, and we know the outlets that still put that dehumanising, those negative stories out there, it's not as consistent, it's not across media as much. And we've also seen more positive, more human stories explaining the issues and barriers people face, but also events like Refugee Week getting more and more coverage, showing the positives as well. If you take your minds back just last summer, actually, during the pandemic, there was lots and lots of stories about people within their communities doing great things, whether that's working as delivery drivers, working in the NHS, supporting elderly residents in their community by delivering food packages. And so while there's other factors, of course, at play, it all can't be down to media. It just shows there is a correlation between the sorts of media we see about refugees and people seeking sanctuary, and also where public concern sits. And that's not just on a national level, that's also very much on a local level too. The other reason I just quickly bring it up is because for those of you that have perhaps done any media before and then read the newspaper comments, or you've been on Twitter or Facebook and you've engaged in a debate about migration, it can seem like there's a really vocal majority out there of people writing dehumanizing stuff, getting into arguments, and completely sitting on the exact opposite of where we sit and our values. This is just to show that that isn't a true representation of where the public sit on these issues. So we actually do have more space than we might think to reach people who could be interested in coming along to your Refugee Week event or your Refugee Week activity. If we could move on to the next slide, please. And this is just going to be one about both trust in local media, but just how many people read and consume local media too. So in terms of the sheer amount of people you can reach about what you're doing for Refugee Week. If I turn your attention to the graph in the top left, the bar chart, and the one on the right hand side, which is in sort of purple colour, this just shows where trust is in local media. And you'll see on the right hand graph, it comes fifth in on the list. So it sits below the likes of BBC and ITV News, but actually people trust what they read in their local paper much more than the likes of the Times, Sky News, even the Guardian, quite surprisingly. And likewise, the one on the top left, where you've got the bar chart, particularly with local newspapers and websites, but also TV and radio to a degree. People trust what they read there much more than perhaps what they see on social media, and even from local faith groups, politicians, personal communications between friends. And then the bottom graph, this is just to show you how much one outlet, and the biggest out there, BBC Regional TV News, has reached since the start of 2021. So this was just for January, but you're looking at over a third of the population in England watched their BBC Regional TV News channel. You start adding in BBC radio stations, community stations, your local newspaper too, and it just gives you an idea of how many people you can reach. And with that, you think about people that perhaps aren't active on Facebook, they aren't online, who wouldn't hear about your Refugee Week event if it isn't in your local newspaper or on a radio station. And similarly, also people that perhaps who don't like your Facebook page, but could be interested in your Refugee Week event. This is a great way for them to find out about it. So that's a bit of the context, and hopefully give some of you that were a bit concerned about media and engaging with the local media, why it could be a useful avenue for you to consider. We're now going to look a little bit at journalists and kind of what their work schedule's like, how you can get in touch with them, and how you can engage them. So the first key thing, journalists, like pretty much all of us, I imagine, they are super, super busy. Consistently for 10, 15 years, staffing levels have been getting cut, but at the same time, they're supposed to deliver lots and lots of stories every day. I remember sort of 10 years back when I was working at the Gloucestershire Echo, I had targets to file 10 different stories a day. And with that, it meant that unless you're, say, at the likes of the Guardian, where you've got a specific subject you cover, they're expected to know lots and lots about lots of different subjects, but often the reality is very different. But I still need to sound like I'm an expert to the readers or the listeners at home. So I remember the one shift I went from covering a rugby league match, something I knew nothing about, the story on homelessness, to a council meeting. I think the Antiques Roadshow was also in town, and I needed to file stories on all of these and make it sound like I knew what was going on about. And if we could move on to the next slide, the reason I bring this up is a couple of reasons. First of all, I was just after people that were experts on a particular issue, that I could get on the phone, that I could speak to them about that rugby league match, I could speak to them about the Antiques Roadshow, and of course, in our case, people I can speak to about Refugee Week, who can give me all the information I need easily so I can get that story out there. There is the negative, because they're so busy that it's really difficult potentially to get their attention. They're getting hundreds of emails each day, hundreds of phone calls, they've got to cover lots of stories, but we are going to now go through some tips how you can get their attention in quite a simple and easy manner to make sure your Refugee Week event or activity does get published and reaches that audience that you'd like to. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So we call getting in touch with journalists, or when you're going to go to them with your Refugee Week event, a pitch. And a pitch, it's nothing complicated. You might have heard the phrase press release as well. And for those of you not familiar with a press release is usually like a one-page Word document about your story, your event, your activity. I'd say nowadays, sometimes you do need a press release, but often a pitch is enough. And a pitch is just a very short email or phone call to a journalist. And we'll talk about how to identify the right journalist shortly, just highlighting the activity, the event, the story you've got on offer in quite a simple and basic and easy to understand manner that's going to grab their attention and is going to really excite them. So then they're going to go, yeah, you know what, I'd love to cover that. Please, can you give me perhaps an interview, some extra information, and we'll write up a piece. If we go on to the next slide, please. In terms of how to put together a pitch, so some of you may already have relationships with journalists at your local newspaper, your local radio station. If so, great. If not, it's all about doing a bit of research and nothing as kind of intense as what Lisa Simpson appears to be doing at the bottom of the page. The best way to do this, I'd say, with your local newspaper, local radio station, first of all, go on that website if it's got one, and have a look for a community reporter. The community reporters, they're always going to be after hearing about activities, events happening within their local community, their local patch in your city, your town, your village. Have a look at them, and often that'll be the right person to go to. You can also do a quick look on social media. So most of the journalists are on Twitter, and on Twitter as well, you'll be able to get an idea of the sorts of stories they cover. They've often got their email address too. I would say if you're really struggling with this, I'll share our email address for IMIX in the chat. You can always give us a shout and we can help do that research for you too. The key thing I'd like you to take away from today, above all else, is keeping it simple. Whatever sort of media communications you're doing, we want no jargon, we want no acronyms. It's just got to be simple and easy to understand for everyone. The reason I say this is because within kind of our bubble of Refugee Week and the various charities, organisations, groups we're in, there's lots of phrases and words we use that are easy to understand for us, but for the vast majority of the general public and journalists too, they won't have a clue what we're speaking about. A common one is ESOL. Most of us know what that means, but if I go and speak to my nan about that, she doesn't have a clue what I'm on about. If I say learning English, yeah, she gets it straight away. So this is the key thing when you're writing a pitch, and as Katherine will touch on with social media, with a press release, whatever it is, it's thinking every time you're putting a word down on a piece of paper, can everyone understand this? And breaking it down as simple as that. If not, if a journalist gets an email and there's words in there they don't understand, it's getting deleted and they'll go on to the next story. And I'd also say just send your pitch with plenty of time before the event. We've spoken about how busy journalists are. So yeah, I'd be not wanting to get in touch the day before because they're probably not going to have time to come to your event or consider covering it at least a week before, if not a couple of weeks before, depending on what you're looking to offer them. If we move on to the next slide now, please. So yeah, in terms of what you want to put in your pitch, alongside the 1 or 2 sentences that explain what your story is, also think about what a journalist might need to make it work. So they're going to probably need interviews of someone involved in the event. They're going to probably need, even for newspaper journalists now, not just TV, but something exciting visually, because they need a good image to go on their Facebook page, to go on the story, because that's what draws audiences in. So make sure you've just got a sentence at the bottom before you sign off in terms of, if you're interested in this, I can provide interviews with A, B, and C. I've also got images, or you could film this, something that helps them get an idea of what you've got to offer. And of course, alongside simplicity, ensure all the basic information they need is easily available. You may be a bit confused by the bottom bullet point, but bear with me, I will explain it to you. And I was taught this when I was at uni, so 10, 12 years back. And the way I always think about crafting a pitch and those simple sentences, it's what I would say to my nan, and feel free to substitute your own family member or friend. She knows nothing about what I do at IMIX, the stories I work on, anything like that. So actually, when I've seen something, whether it's something happening at the co-op at the top of my road, when I'm walking to work, I want to fill her in on my day. What's that first line when you get back home, you're speaking to your friend, your family member, and you're like, you never guess what I've just seen. That is the 1 or 2 lines about your Refugee Week event, that the most important, essential information, when you're describing it to someone else, those are just the 2 sentences that forms your pitch that's going to go to that journalist to get their attention. And underneath that, the sentence on the interviews, what's available visually. That's all it is. If we could move on to the next slide, because that's pitching. In terms of crafting a wider story, and this will be useful outside of Refugee Week too, but often I had this misconception too until a few years ago. I was just thinking, you know, facts, figures, evidence, all that sort of stuff. That's what stories and news are all about. But it isn't. Stories are much more about having something human that people can engage with, and they'll have much more of an impact in interesting readers, watchers, listeners of a radio station program. So when you're putting your story together, and this will probably, in pretty much 99% of cases, I'd say, already being incorporated in your event or your activity, first of all, it's about empowering, creating space for people with lived experience to share their story where they feel comfortable. Also, your Refugee Week events are going to be ticking this box anyway, but community-based stories, that's what a local paper, a local radio station is going to be interested about. When you're contacting a journalist and they're seeing your email, they're going to go, why are my readers, why are my listeners going to be interested in this? And I'd say in 9 times out of 10, most cases, that's already going to be clear, but if not, make sure it is. And about keeping it authentic, genuine and local. So yeah, again, you should be ticking the box there. A simplicity, again, we've spoken about that, but just in terms of humanizing with the language we use. The reason I say this is because, again, some of the terms, be it asylum seeker, refugee, a lot of people won't understand what those terms mean. And for the vast majority of the general public too, they see those words used often at BBC News at 10 once every 6 months. So perhaps they have certain misconceptions already with that. Whereas actually, if you're using words like people seeking safety, or actually humanizing it further than that, so I might be saying Abdul the barber, father, people seeking safety in general. When I'm putting that in my pitch, when I'm putting in my Refugee Week event, people can connect with that. They've got some, perhaps, of course, they may not be a refugee, but if they're a father too, perhaps they share that occupation. That's something that's going to connect them and draw them into. Moving swiftly on, because I know we're a little bit tight for time, just a few things on safeguarding. In terms of before doing any media, it's all about honest conversations and weighing up the potential impact, both for yourself, the charity organisation you're part of, and also friends and colleagues. Once you've done any sort of media, 2 things, it can end up anywhere, and it's going to also be impossible to retract. So if you do a newspaper interview, they're going to have a Facebook, a Twitter page. They're also going to have an online website. Same with the radio station, all the BBC news outlets, they've got their Twitter accounts. So it's worth considering, right, I'm doing it for this newspaper, but it can also end up elsewhere too. Is that something you're happy, you're comfortable with? And does that impact the sorts of information you want to share? If we move on to the next slide too, is finally, and I would say in terms of the final point, in terms of like any negative attention that can come your way, particularly for those that we touched on it earlier, but for those of you who've done local media before, or perhaps see the sort of debates that can happen on Twitter and Facebook, it still doesn't mean it's for everyone in terms of seeing those public attitudes, but making sure your online profile is secure. And also just a bit of context, I spoke to a group in Wales who are working, supporting people in the camp currently being used in Penally, and they were quite upset. They did a Wales Online piece and it had sort of 200+ negative comments, which was of course very upsetting. Unfortunately, it's the situation, but of course it shouldn't be the case. And I kind of had a chat to them. We had a little look about how many people read that news outlet, and 5.5 million different people go to Wales Online each month to read the news. So of course, nowhere near 5.5 million people read that story, but it's substantially more people that read that story, didn't feel compelled to write a negative comment, and actually came away with a much better understanding and a different reaction to that piece. It'll be exactly the same case with your Refugee Week events or activities. So it's also just worth having a bit of that context as well. That's all from me. I'm happy to take any questions. If I think Emily was going to send them over.
Thanks, Niall. So, oh, sorry. Feel free to put your questions in the chat for Niall. I'm just going to have a look. All right, I'll just give us a little bit of time if anyone would like to put questions in the chat. All right, thanks, Mara. We've got a question from Mara, which is, how do you ensure that you have a support network, following on from the point you just made now?
Yeah, so I mean, from my own perspective, so when I'm working with anyone, it's nothing complicated. But from my own perspective, when I'm working with people, so for example, Refugee Week each year, I work with a number of people that have sought sanctuary that have not done media before, but they wish to do media. So all I'll do are a lot of this information, but in more detail. I'll meet up with them 2 or 3 times, go through kind of the potential benefits, but also some of the negatives that may come their way. Just so, first of all, before doing any media, people are very clear on kind of positives, the negatives, and it's all about them then making their own decision. If they say no, that's absolutely fine. And if they say yes, I'll then help them get in touch with the journalist. But also afterwards, it's all about not just, oh, great, we've got that story in that newspaper, that's done. Actually just checking in afterwards. For those of you that have done interviews before, we're all our own worst critics. So even if you've done a fantastic job, usually you've got that voice in your head, I know I do, where you've kind of realised you've made a little mistake. The audience at home hasn't realised that, but actually just following up with the person, telling them they've done a great job, checking in that they're okay, just in the days and the weeks after, just something as simple as that can be really helpful and beneficial. And so likewise with your own organisations, whether that's with a group of volunteers, a group of staff, whatever it is, just having some people that can give that reassurance, that can be there for support if need to be, and just to have a general chat, conversation, just as simple as that can be very helpful. And I would again reiterate, and I'll pop it in the chat box after this little Q&A is finished, I'll pop in our email address, because if you ever have a particular issue or a very specific question, both now and moving forwards, you can get in touch with us too.
Thanks, Niall. They're coming in thick and fast now. Anna, you had a question about reach on social media, so I'm just going to make a note of that, and I'll put it to, we can put it to Cheyenne and Katherine, who are going to be moving on to social media in a moment. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions, Niall. Viv asks, how do you find a friendly reporter? And Margie has a question about press releases. So she says that if she sends a fully written press release to her local paper, they tend to print it. But she's asking if she sent them just a few facts, would they be more engaged if she just sent them a few facts and then let them write the piece?
Okay, great. So the friendly reporter side of things, it's again just about doing that research. So what I found when I first started working in the West Midlands, I identified, because a lot of the stories I was doing was community based, I did a bit of research on the various newspaper websites. I found a community reporter, and then what I did as well, I had a look at their Twitter, I had a look at the sorts of stories they were writing. So not just on, say, refugee or wider migration issues, but other stories they wrote, and just getting an idea of how they write about these. Are they quite sensationalist? Are they quite tabloidy and just after like a quick big headline? Or were they actually seem to be quite sympathetic and understanding in the way they covered a range of different issues? And again, it's things like that and building that up over time. So you'll often won't have the perfect journalist. I would say, like I said, from my own experience, you're expected to cover lots and lots of different subjects. So even very well-meaning on-side journalists that perhaps haven't covered refugee stories, Refugee Week before, they might have picked up on some of the kind of dehumanizing language and narratives that are used by kind of national media outlets. So sometimes there's a bit of patience that's needed as well, and just explaining bit by bit, story by story, well, actually, this phrase, this word isn't helpful, or actually, this part of the piece was great, but from our perspective, this would be great to improve on next time. So yeah, just a lot of research, taking an educated guess, but often you'll find if you start reading the sorts of stories they're putting out there, the conversations you have with the journalist too, like a big red flag for me would be that first time you're doing a story and they're going to be interviewing someone that I'm putting forward that's got their own lived experience to share. If they're happy to have a chat with me about putting boundaries, potentially making someone anonymous in place, and they're very understanding and open to that, that's someone I'm going to work with. Actually, if the person's just like, oh, look, I'm on a deadline, I need to get this story, and not really open to that, I'm thinking, yeah, that's a journalist I do not want to work with. So yeah, it's something we could speak about quite a lot and in more detail, but those would kind of be the basic tips. And on the press release, I mean, I'd say great. If you are doing a press release and you've got the capacity to do that and it's working, definitely stick by it. We will talk about press releases and pitching more in the workshop later. It was more just due to the length of time we've got. Often, if you don't have the capacity or the time to write a press release, a pitch can be enough. You've probably got to do a bit more work with writing interviews, with supporting and setting up interviews and providing a bit more information back and forth on an email. So yeah, if you can do a press release, it's getting used as it is, I'd stick with that. But if not, it was just to say a pitch can often be enough to get a journalist's attention, and then you can get all those other pieces with interviews into place to get that news piece afterwards.
Thanks, Dar. And I think I'm just going to mute you now. Yeah, I think that's worked. So because of time, we are going to move on to the social media section. Patrick, Eleanor and Lorraine, I've made a note of your questions and we'll follow up with those later. I'll pass those on to Niall. Thank you so much, Niall. That was absolutely invaluable guidance. And also some really interesting links and useful info and opportunities being shared in the chat. So do keep an eye on that as well. Eleanor says her question was covered. Awesome. I'm going to hand over to Katherine, social media manager at IMIX, and Cheyenne, who is my colleague at Counterpoint Arts. She's our social media officer.
Hi, I'm just going to carry on sharing our slides with you. So when we're thinking about social media, one of the things that we can get obsessed about really quickly is getting a really big following, or how we can make a post go viral. But it's really, really important to think about your specific audience and how to create engaging content for your particular audience. That's really, really important. If you have 200, 300 really engaged supporters, that can be really good in terms of like local activism or a local event. So we don't always need to be thinking in terms of like massive numbers. I've got a few little examples here of really big campaigns that have been really successful. And when the PowerPoint goes up on the website, you can maybe look at those in a bit more detail. One thing here I just wanted to point out was something which Freedom from Torture did last week, I think it was, where they got somebody who's living inside the Napier barracks to take questions on Twitter. So it's sort of a Twitter takeover by someone in the barracks. And I thought that was brilliant because it gave us like a direct access to someone who's experiencing the issues right now. And I think we could think in our comms about how we could involve the people that we work with, how we can involve people from a refugee background or people seeking asylum in the comms that we put out there. And something joyful always goes down well on social media. So social media that creates an impact is visually strong. So having an image to go with your social media post is really important, or even a video. Those posts always get more engagement and always get shared more. Something which is simple, as Niall, he went into that in quite a lot of detail, but we need to be thinking in terms of simple and accessible language. As Niall said, a lot of people will not understand the terms that we use. So we need to think about what are people going to understand? How can I put this in the simplest terms? Also, you don't want to, in a social media post, go into all the complexities of the asylum or the immigration system. Keep it simple. Try to stay focused on one point per social media post. Things that are quirky, funny and surprising always do well on social media, particularly at the moment when people are looking for distractions from the sort of how mundane everything is at the moment. So keep your audience in mind at all times. We're going to talk about this a bit more in a minute, but it's really important to think about who are you communicating to and what do they want to hear from me. Tell stories. Stories always draw people in. So you could tell stories of the people that you work with, even of your volunteers or your fundraisers. It can be a broad spectrum of people that you work with, but it's really always really heartwarming to read a story. And that is something which often speaks to your heart. Things which have an emotional pull often do very well on social media as well. And that makes them really compelling. So we want to compel people with our social media posts. And that means that when people look at your social media posts, it makes them want to take action. And maybe that action will be they're going to come to your event. Maybe it'll be they'll volunteer at your event. They're going to share your event on social media with other people. So we want to be creating posts that make people want to take action. So when we're thinking about our audience, it's really, really important to think about who we're talking to. We're not talking to everybody. as much as we'd like everybody in the United Kingdom to think and feel the same we do about Refugee Week, that's probably unlikely. So we have to be really focused. And it's important to focus your social media kind of efforts on the platform that's working best for you. It can be really easy to spread ourselves too thin on social media and think we have to have all the social media platforms. But actually look at what you've got. Where is your social media working well already? Where have you got a following? Where are people engaging? And just work on making that platform the best that it can be. So as a quick overview, Facebook is generally for a slightly older audience. It has a family, community feel to it, very good for community organising, good for event promotion. You can also host online events on Facebook, really good to get involved in local community groups on Facebook. That'd be a really good place to promote your events. And WhatsApp can also be good for organising local groups or organising groups around a particular interest. Twitter is a more political space. It's very newsy, fast moving, campaign focused. If you've got an event that feels quite political, it's based around a campaign, you could maybe promote that on Twitter. Instagram is a visual platform. It's focused around stories and it works a lot better with a younger audience. But you do need to have good photos to put on Instagram. So that's really something to consider. So here are some examples of things which work well on the different platforms. So in terms of engaging your audience, you want them to feel involved in what you're doing. So I talk about this thing called using the language of involvement. So using active verbs in the language that you're using. So phrases like join us, take part, act now, come along, write, tweets, which make people feel like that they can be a part of your event. They can be a part of what you're doing. That makes your audience feel engaged and like they're active participants. So we don't want our audiences to feel too passive. We want them to feel like, I want to share that or take part or volunteer at that event. So it's really good to encourage questions and interactions on your social media posts. That makes them more popular. So can you ask people questions like, what are you looking forward to about Refugee Week? Or what have your experiences of Refugee Week been like in the past? So encourage that sense of interaction and discussion and engagement. We want to give our audiences value for money. So not that they're paying often, but like value from our account. So we want to be educating them, empowering them with our content and just really engaging them. We want people to feel like, I just really have to go along to that event. It sounds so exciting, so engaging. I really want to be part of it. So Asnal, he's already covered quite a lot on language, but important to keep our language simple, not using technical or insider language. People's knowledge is very limited. So let's keep our language as broad as possible. Make the audience feel engaged and involved, and make our language really lively and active and accessible. And just a final word from me on persistence. Sometimes we might feel like we don't have a lot of social media content, but it's really okay to repeat content. We can often think about having one piece of content but promoting it in different ways, or having one event and promoting it in different ways. So you could think about, well, one social media post, I might think about the people who are going to be volunteering at the event. And then I might think about the people who are going to be speaking at the event. And then I'm going to think about the themes of the event. So you can come at it from different angles. And if you look at sort of some of the very popular and professional accounts, you'll find they're repeating their messaging a lot. So it's the same message, sometimes delivered in slightly different ways. Sometimes they even just directly repeat content. And it's a good idea when you're thinking about developing a social media account to look at how popular accounts are doing it. What are they doing? What can I learn from them? And you'll see that often they're repeating the same message over and over. So don't worry about repeating yourself. You need to be really, really persistent in terms of promoting an event. You need to keep reminding people up to the day of the event because people will forget, people are busy. So just keep prodding people, keep putting the seed in their head so that they know that this is the event, it's today, and I really want to go to it. So I'm going to hand over to Cheyenne, who's going to talk a little bit more about promoting your event on social media.
Great, thank you. If we go on to the next slide. So when it comes to promoting your event outside of paid social media advertising, my first step would always be to write a spread the word message to any friends, partner organizations, collaborators, like anyone that you are friendly with, And I would give them a brief intro to the event with any relevant links included. And if you can, give them some existing social media posts so that they can just simply retweet it or share it. Or if they're feeling very generous, so they can copy and paste onto their own channels, you will make it much easier for people to help you. And I would also always be generous, like how can you help them? Can you offer your audience to another similar organization who are running an event on a different day? And then when it comes to expanding outside of your network, if we go on to the next slide, so you can do a bit of research and find other related networks. So I would sit down and pull out some of the themes for your Refugee Week event. So if you're running an event that's like really centered around your local neighborhood, or you're screening a film online, build connections with those kind of groups. So some starting points for finding those spaces, Katherine mentioned Facebook local interest groups. So these are often really large and you can find them quite easily. There's local interest clubs who might have a mailing list for their members and supporters, and student clubs and societies as well. You can also ask people on Twitter who are like influencers that you think would, if you're running a comedy event, getting in touch with some comedians that you think would be friendly to it. But I would say in general, when it comes to spreading the word or asking people for a social media favor, make it explicit why their network or why they should be interested in your event and tailor what you're sending out to them. I think what people kind of go wrong with this sometimes is a feeling of spamming absolutely anyone and everyone. So if you do a bit of research, this can be a really powerful tool to just get the word out about your event without any kind of paid social media budget behind it. If we go on to the next slide. So when it comes to thinking about your content strategy and something that works for you and your audience, there you might have seen or might not have seen, there's currently a lot of hype at the moment about how the Instagram algorithm, for instance, works, or what type of content you should only be posting this, or you should never post that. And I know it can feel overwhelming, even if you just focus on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. There are so many different kinds of posts that you can make, from reels, stories, everything else. But there's no real one size fits all strategy that we can recommend. But what I would say is between now and Refugee Week, we've got a fair amount of time. So I would take this opportunity to post consistently and post regularly, but experiment a little bit. Look at what works for you and what doesn't work for you. If you post a video and absolutely no one watches it, then you've learned something about it now rather than learning something about it closer to your big event. And you'll just kind of get more of an insight into like what Katherine is saying about your audience, what gets you new followers, what gets people clicking on your links. So yeah, I would love to be able to give you like a very obvious, like, here's a strategy in a second, but I think just learn and dig deep and discover how your audience wants to interact with you. If we go on to the next slide, in the run up to any kind of big event, I will pull together a basic content plan, and it can just be a spreadsheet or it can be a list, however it works for you. The way that I approach it is that I will sort of start by drafting a list of key messages and key posts that I want to do. So I probably will start with a save the date post. I'll announce the lineup, give information on how to book. I'll decide which social media channels I'll focus on. So probably for us and probably for lots of you, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And then the rest of it is a bit of like content creation or a bit of research. So find the photos and videos that you want to use in advance so that you're not in a big panic. So if you've got any gaps in your resources, you've got some time to kind of pull those together. If you would like, do some research of hashtags that you can share. So obviously there's Refugee Week hashtags, which will be at the end of this presentation, but maybe there's others that are related to your event. Do some research and pull those out now so you don't have to do it every time you want to go and post something. And if you're collaborating with other people or you've got like a speaker lineup, just have a list of all their organizational handles and their personal social media tags so that you've got that prepared. And where possible, I will use a social media scheduler to plan this out in advance to save myself a bit of time in the run up to the actual event. And then it means that you can respond to other things ad hoc when you need to. And if we go into and this is an example from just like 2 days from Refugee Week last year. So like you can see that we kind of had like a bit of a plan for, okay, our Instagram story focus today is going to be on simple acts. Here's some notes. Did this go out? What time? Where? So it doesn't have to be anything particularly complicated or terrifying or anything fancy. It can literally just be a spreadsheet or a list that works for you. If we go on to the next slide. So Niall spoke about this earlier, and Katherine did as well. The same principles apply to social media. The internet is forever. So when it comes to sharing anything, especially if there's lived experience involved, keep that in mind about whatever's going out there. When it comes to social media accounts, I would make sure that you've got strong, unique passwords for all of your different profiles. I would double check the email linked to your social media accounts and just make sure that you actually know who has access to your social media channels. And ahead of your event, I would assign someone, if you can, to monitor social media. So it doesn't need to be 24/7, but just someone who is involved in the running of the event, whose job is to keep an eye on what's coming in on social media. And when it comes to social media and trolling, I would say block and mute tools are your friend, as are the report functions. So don't feel like you just have to deal with abusive comments coming in. Absolutely just block and mute it. And there's like lots more resources that we can talk about on this. So that'll be in the resources list. So some interesting reports and some useful tips for how to kind of manage that situation. And yeah, as mentioned, when it comes to consent, make sure that you've thought about that when it comes to social media. So when it comes to identifying details, photos, sharing anyone's personal story, because once it's out there, it's going to be very difficult to completely delete it off the internet. And yeah, so how to get involved with Refugee Week social media campaign. So we'll be sharing the simple acts and we'll be promoting this on social media. So this is something that you can share as well. We've got the hashtags of Refugee Week 2021, hashtag Refugee Week, and hashtag We Cannot Walk Alone. And we'll be releasing this year's pre-made social media assets quite soon. So you can see that these are the Imagine graphics and Simple Acts graphics from last year. But yeah, when we release these, then you're more than welcome to use these social media assets to help with your own event. And the final thing I would say on how to get involved is that there are 96 people in this call. Can you help each other spread the word about all your various events? Like it won't all be happening at the same time, and I'm sure that there's lots of you who can support each other. So there we are. I think we've got time for some questions on social media now.
Fabulous, thanks Sharon and Katherine. We can kick off with, yes, Anna's question that she asked earlier. So she had a question regarding reach. Anna says, I heard that the algorithms mean that smaller community groups will have more difficulty reaching people, especially if they don't pay for ads on social media. Any tips on having a better reach on a budget?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the algorithm stuff comes up quite a lot at the moment. I think there's like a lot of like nervousness around Instagram. I think on reaching people, like I said, I think making sure that everyone in your team sort of likes and engages with your content and shares it to their audiences is like a really good first step of like just getting the word out there. And on a better reach with a budget, I think it's actually really easy to, I'm curious to see what Katherine thinks, but I think it's really easy to kind of always be thinking about like reach, but actually engagement is also pretty key. So if you can, if you want to think about like how to, focusing on how to get as many people engaging with your content is like also a really key metric. So I think those tips that I mentioned about like spreading the word to your networks and reaching out to people whose audiences would be interested, I think would be my tactic for doing that on a budget.
Yeah, I think I was just going to add that your existing audience are also people who are like your message takers to other people. So if you can get the message to your audience and encourage them to share it with other people, that's a good way to expand your audience reach. But that does mean that you have to make sure that your social media account is working really well for your existing audience, so you don't just sort of abandon them and just think about, I just want more followers. Like, how is your account, how does that have value for the people who are already following and committed? And then if you make it good enough, they'll share it with other people. So it's really important to stay focused on what you do have and think about how can they take the message out and how can I help them to do that. So not ignoring the audience that you already have. And certainly if you have a post, particularly on Facebook, if you have a post where you've asked a question or you've started a discussion, that will push it up the algorithm. So then it will go to the top of people's newsfeeds because you're having an interesting conversation on your page, and then other people will be able to see that. So it is about creating engaging content that provokes discussion as well.
Thanks, Katherine. We've got quite a few questions coming in. I'm going to give you 3. So the first one is from Buto, asking which social media scheduler would you recommend? The second one's from Simon, asking how LinkedIn might be used to promote a Refugee Week event, whether that would be useful. And the third one is a big one from Phoebe. She says, there's hundreds of events happening at the moment. How do you make yours stand out?
So on social media scheduler, there's a couple that we have listed in the resources that we can use. There's now a lot more that you can do directly on different social media platforms. So you can do it directly on Twitter, and you can also use something called TweetDeck to schedule your tweets. And there's also something called Facebook Creator Studio, which will be linked to the resources, which will help you manage Instagram and Facebook posts. But there's also lots of third-party social media scheduling out there. I quite like Hootsuite and Buffer, which have like free-ish versions. And there's also apps called Later and Planoly, I think that's how you say it, which are really good for visually planning Instagram content. So you can kind of pick between the like in-house tools and third-party tools when it comes to social media scheduling.
I was just going to say on, you might have something as well to say about LinkedIn, but one of the things about LinkedIn, I mean, like, I guess as we were saying, which audience is on like which platform, and then are they the kinds of people who are going to come to your event? If you're having a local event, and I guess at this stage, it's hard to know whether it's going to be in person or online. So that will change the nature of your audience. If it's online, obviously the reach could be wider than just your immediate geography. However, if the event is kind of focused on something from your location, the people who are going to join online are still going to be people who are probably connected to you geographically. So are the contacts that you have on LinkedIn, are they people you're connected to geographically? Are they going to be interested in your event? So you always have to be thinking about your audience and what kinds of people are going to come to this event, why they're going to come to this event. Some people might come to the event because it's a music event and they just love music, and they don't really, you know, it's great that it's Refugee Week and everything, but I just really love this kind of music. Or they might be really interested in cookery. Or so there's different reasons why people might engage, and it might not always just be because it's a Refugee Week event. And that's the brilliant thing about Refugee Week event. It's Refugee Week. There's so many different things about it that you can draw people in through different avenues. It doesn't have to be because they're really passionate and interested in issues around refugees. So it's thinking about, I guess, the contacts on LinkedIn. What are they interested in? Is it worth like using that platform to promote my event? Are they going to come along? So it's really thinking about interest areas, and I think it is where Facebook does work particularly well, because there are interest groups on Facebook and there are geographical groups on Facebook where people gather and share either bits of local information or an interest in a particular topic. And sometimes those two things come together, like a local refugees welcome group on Facebook. So it's linked by geography, but it's also linked by interest. So that's where Facebook groups work really well. Do you want to say anything else about LinkedIn, Cheyenne?
No, I think that pretty much covers LinkedIn. I was going to pick up on Phoebe's question about how to make your event stand out. So that's a really good question. And yeah, I definitely feel that at the moment, because we're all home and we're all online more, there is quite a lot of stuff out there. I would just think about it in terms of yourself, like what makes you want to spend an hour of your time on a call like this? It's because you hope to get something out of it. So I would try to think about like how you can offer like a taster or a trailer for people coming to your event. If it's a panel event, then can you share something that the speakers in the past have presented to so that people understand like who's going to be taking part? If it's some sort of arts workshop, is it like giving people like a taste of like what they could be making during the workshop? If it's a film, can it be a part of the film? I think basically let people know why it's going to be worth them, spending an hour of time coming to your event. So it'll obviously be different depending on what your event is and what your activities are and what the format is, but try to pull out like one thing that you think that's going to be this is what I want people to get out of it, and that's going to be what I'm going to focus on in promoting it.
I'd also really think about visuals, and even if you make even talking to your phone and making a little video about the event, even if you're not like expert at presenting or expert at video making, that's the sort of thing that would just feel maybe like a little bit different, particularly on Instagram. So something that's visual, again, because I think visuals can often capture the sense of an event as well. So are there any visuals or videos or something that you could use to make your event stand out? And remember, you're not trying to attract the whole of the internet to your event. So you want to attract probably local people who've got shared interest, who are going to be interested in the topic, who might want to take action. So really thinking about those people and why might they want to engage, rather than thinking the internet is so big and sprawling and how am I going to get people to engage. It's like being really focused about who you're going to attract and how to attract those specific people.
Thanks, Katherine and Cheyenne. I'm wondering if we can squeeze in one last question before we finish, which ties into what you've already been talking about. Martin asked, how does a YouTube channel fit into the constellation of social media platforms?
Great question. Something that we did across Counterpoints Arts and Refugee Week is that we streamed a lot of our events directly onto YouTube or on Facebook Live. Actually, Tom is the YouTube expert here, actually, even more so than me. He's the one who really pioneered that tactic for us. But yeah, YouTube is, I think there's like a lot to research on YouTube. I can send you some resources if that's something that you're really interested in. But yeah, I think that it's a good way to kind of capture events afterwards. So for people who can't attend your event, for them to be able to watch it back later, to put captions on so people can like process it in their own time, like have like a record of your event. I think that's the main way I currently use YouTube in terms of events planning. So yeah, Katherine, I'm not sure if you've got something to mention on that.
I guess I think one thing is I'd be wary of investing too much time in a YouTube channel if you're not picking up much traction with it, because YouTube in particular is quite a big investment. You've got to be putting out videos really quite regularly to sort of gather a following and sort of build that up. And I imagine a lot of people are probably quite under-resourced and don't have loads of capacity, and it might be better if you're interested in experimenting with video format to use it on Instagram, where you can kind of mix it up a bit, so you can have some videos, some storytelling posts, some photos, so it's not always really heavily reliant on you making loads of videos, because I think unless you're got a lot of time to dedicate to that and it's quite a skill, it's going to take a lot of work. And yeah, I feel like you'd have to sort of think about how much work am I putting in and how much am I going to get out. So but if it's an area of interest and you want to develop it, then go for it, but just be aware it's a big investment.
Thanks, Katherine. I cannot believe the amount the three of you have covered in 1 hour and 1 minute. Anna, I see your question about TikTok, and we will follow up on that by email afterwards. Thank you so much for being here. it's been a really fascinating morning, certainly from our point of view, and I'm going to hand over to Niall to wrap up.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much again for everyone coming along today. Been a real pleasure to meet you all virtually. And for those we don't speak to between now and Refugee Week, hope you all have fantastic events, although I'm sure we'll end up speaking to some of you. As Emily said, any questions we haven't had chance to answer because of time, we've been documenting them and we will follow up via email afterwards. It may just take a day or two. And just some quick things to keep an eye on over the next few months that may be helpful. So we've got media and social media packs. So a lot of the tips and advice we've spoken about today and other sorts of content in a bit more detail, they'll be released during April and May on the Refugee Week website. Likewise, just as long-term support, I will pop the email in the chat box because I've forgotten to do that shortly. And we can also follow up via email. And just finally to say about our ambassador project, which I touched on. So this is something each year we run, people with lived experience who haven't done media before, but perhaps wish to be engaged and do some sort of media. We run training workshops for sort of 10, 15 people every year. So that's something as well we'll be advertising. And whether it's of interest to you or perhaps someone in your network or your community, please do feel free to check that out when that's announced in the next couple of months. Yeah, thank you very much and great to meet you all. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Hope to see you again soon.